Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad Podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and help you on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the Fatherhood Authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Welcome to I Am Dad Podcast. We're honored today to have with us Jason Allen. He's a trailblazer in education and advocating, and he's going to be joining us today as the National Director of Partnerships for the National Parents Union. Jason has been at the forefront of empowering parents to take an active role in shaping the educational landscape. His work doesn't just stop there. Through his company, Educational Entities LLC, he harnesses the power of digital storytelling to amplify voices that are often unheard. Today, we'll explore Jason's journey, his passionate advocacy for male engagement, and the profound impact of his family's foundation, the Lillie's Foundation, on communities. We'll also dive into some insights from his book, Suit, Swagg, and Success, discussing strategies for engaging and uplifting Black males. So let's get ready for a conversation full of inspiration, strategies, and real-life stories that celebrate the role of fathers and male figures in nurturing and leading change. Join us as we dig deep into this conversation with Mr. Jason Allen. How you doing today, sir?
I am doing good, man. I'm so excited to be a part of the podcast that I feel like I'm always listening to, and now I get a chance to be a part of the conversation. So it's really good to be here.
Thanks for being here. It's a joy to have you. You know, I follow you and have been following you for a very long time, and very inspired by your work. It's a piece of work that we're passionate about in our space, and oftentimes don't get to because the work that we're specifically doing is so overwhelming with dads, but we're very clear. And I talk about this all the time, that we have to be mindful that when we're dealing with dads, we're dealing with men, we're dealing with males, and there's aspects of being a father that roll into the responsibilities of being men. And so your work complements our work, and so we are always supportive of the work that you're doing, and I know that you are supportive of what we're doing. Jason, here's how we start I Am Dad Podcast. Since you watch it, I'm gonna hit you with this question, and I know you're ready for it. Tell me your daddy story.
So, major shout out to my daddy. In fact, actually, even in my grown age, I still call my father daddy. Like, I remember growing up, and that was a thing. Like, it was just a respect factor. So, a major shout out to my father, Darryl Allen. He's an entrepreneur in the family, but also in the city of Atlanta. And I learned a lot from him, a lot that I put in my practices as a teacher, but also just as a significant, influencer of my work in male and fatherhood engagement. Always saw the importance of having fathers at the helm of what we do in and out of schools, but community is where I saw fatherhood the most. Growing up in Atlanta, I definitely would say my dad's story was very unique because even growing up near the projects, like most of my classmates, like they knew their dad, whether they had a good story connected to them or not. They knew their dad. They were connected to their dads. I can remember growing up playing, rec ball, whether it was basketball, whether it was baseball, and they wouldn't let me play football. But even in that space, I remember my dad and other dads showing up. I remember the dads being close enough to the games, but close enough to the parking lot to have that time just to kind of connect, and whatever dads, did during those games. Like, that was dad's time to be there and show up, even if it was in and out. Like, I came in and I just wanted to see them run, and they knew like somebody could come back and say, yeah, your dad came through before he went to work or the club or wherever. So my dad's story is very unique. My dad has been engaged He has 3 kids, but he also put 5 other kids in our community through college. And these young brothers are dads, their fathers. They are doing for their families what they learned from my dad. And so we are real big on community. So yeah, major shout out to my dad. I wanted to just share a little bit about how I became organizer, teacher, all of that. Like my dad, even though he's an entrepreneur, he is all of those things. And so yeah, dads have a major influence on what we do in our lives.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so important that we share those stories because we don't often get the platform, to talk about the wonderful things that our fathers mean to us. And I'm glad that you kind of alluded to that, when you talk about your community and what your community looks like. We say all the time, there's no such thing as a fatherless child. 100% of all biological beings on the planet Earth has a biological child. The question isn't if he exists, the question is where he exists. And if you're not looking for him, you can't find him. The problem with that is we don't look for him and then we tell our children that he doesn't exist and they don't know how to define and navigate the hole that's left in their heart by an absent dad. And so we got to really begin to start uplifting the stories, specifically of Black men and Black dads, wherever they are in life. And we got to be focused on hearing their stories and knowing both stories because we lead our lives sometimes so heavily on the story that we've created in our mind that we don't even take time to go and find out his story, the other story, because there's nuances and things in their stories that can help us in our own lives.
True.
The other thing, Jason, that I like to do, before we really get started talking is I'm always interested in how people get into the work that they're in and what drives them and why you're passionate about doing this thing that you do specifically with Black males.
Super dope. So I would have to say I've always really been connected to this work. It goes back to my early days in college. Um, my college best friend and our former college professor, major shout out to Dr. Saeed Sewell. Uh, we were at a PWI. Dr. Sewell graduated from Morehouse and saw uniquely how we did not have the number of professors on the university or campus needed to fit the needs of the Black and brown students who were there, in particular Black boys who, we were generating money for them. We were coming into the school, right? But we weren't staying. And so I was, a young activist then, coming from a family of organizers and educators. When I came into class, me and my college best friend, who is a PK, so we came in with the fangs and the chains on, and he was like, "Oh, I know these brothers, GPAs, and I know their family background. What are y'all doing?" But we had a little bit of freedom because we were away from, daddy couldn't snatch us up and be like, "Oh, you what?" So, he kind of reeled us in, and we created an organization called Black Males with Initiative. This was in 2001. That began my work around male and fatherhood engagement, and really helping Black young men matriculate, Black young men who some were becoming fathers while they were in college, right? Matriculate through college and really meet the end goal of taking this institutional knowledge to further liberate our people and break economic, cycles of poverty that some of us have lived through and have come through and have freed our people from. And so that's how my work, it started. It also led me to teaching. My daddy's story also connects to you gave up grants to go to law school to become a teacher. Like you went through
Right.
all this, and in the beginning, it was kind of like free scholarship. You going to law school, you're gonna be doing what I've seen you do. All of your childhood, wanting to be like the Black Perry Mason, but I ended up becoming a teacher from that work of engaging males in the community and seeing how young brothers that summer of graduation connected to us. It was about 17 of my senators. I was SGA president. We had gotten a contract and were basically asked by the city to run the summer programs. And 11 out of the 17 of us that were supposed to go to law school became educators and are still educating children and leading communities to this day. So it was meant for us to not go to law school, obviously, right? And be engaged with the young people, because those young Black boys were like, yeah, we have people who come and like speak to us, but nobody has really been like intentional about seeing us and seeing our families and like really spitting game to us about how, even if you choose to do this, there still is a better way of doing it so that your future generations don't have to do it. And that's breaking the cycle. That's my
Yeah.
that's my early story. That's my start.
That's a cool story. I mean, I love it. I think that, I always say that everything that we go through in life is purposeful,
Yes.
right? That we don't see it when we're going through it, but as you continue your journey, you can look back on your path and be like, now I see why I went through that. Now I see why I saw that. Now I see why I had to learn that, because those things became the foundations for the work that I do now and the passion that I'm driven to do. I want to talk to you a little bit about Atlanta, being that you were born and raised in Atlanta, because for someone like myself who was born in New York, our backdrop was somewhat different, but the same, given that everybody back when I was growing up came from this way. They migrated into New York from Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina. So we was basically up south, right? We weren't down south, we were up south.
Yeah.
And so all of our families had Southern roots, Southern values, Southern traditions that drove how we functioned in this new place. But I've always been fascinated with the South because my mother used to send me to North Carolina every summer of my life from like 4 years old to almost like 14 to 15
Yeah.
years old. So I spent all of my summers on the farm. So I know country life. In fact, when I think about the earlier memorable experiences of my life, almost all of them were in Elm City, North Carolina, on my uncle's farm, right? And being in that space. How has Atlanta transitioned from what you knew it as a kid to now? And how do you still see the old tradition here, or do you think that it's being lost a little bit?
That whole conversation piece around tradition, I think that those, like in my generation, that was my experience also from childhood to about 14 until I started working. We were in the country during the summertime with our great grandparents and our grandparents. And um, it is a difference because I can see like my sisters, they didn't have that same experience. Like in the summer times, we're going to like our grandparent houses. It was like, okay, it's time change. More kids started getting connected to, band camps and all those type of things that were happening, right?
Right.
So the traditions changed. I look at Atlanta, it can go back to, the time of the Olympics. I can go back to when the projects were here. I went to Frederick Douglass High School. I'm sitting up here looking at my class ring right now. I graduated in the year 2000. Still have my class ring because we had this sense of tradition that was also laid in the foundation of who we are as a people. Now, I will also say Atlanta has lost a tradition of this sense. When you went to a high school here in Atlanta in the 50s, when they first started allowing us to, have access to
Right.
like high school, right? Going
Education.
back to, some of our oldest black high schools. But the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, going to high school in Atlanta was like going to an HBCU. But Morris Brown specifically was very intentional about connecting with our schools. So everyone had that impact. Even if you were not going to college or technical school, Morris Brown was intentional about reaching those students so they knew that even if you don't see it for yourself right now, at 12, 13, 14, we have this outreach program that's going to reach out to kids. So when they do get to the time period of, hey, I'm getting ready to graduate and I have this option, we're going to bring you in. That has changed in Atlanta because Atlanta went through a huge cheating scandal debacle that happened with Morris Brown initially, and also the local schools. And so that kind of goes back to an historical trait that we see in black meccas like Atlanta, like Tulsa, like Baltimore, like so many places where once black people they gain economic and educational access, and we started to build wealth, and we started to do it as a community. All of these outside barriers and factors come to dismantle it. And so how I see Atlanta now is when we look at black and brown families being the most disproportionately represented in the working poor class, in poverty, that's an issue. When Atlanta, by my classmate, and fellow Astro Ti, will say this is a black Mecca, this is Wakanda. But then you think about what we saw in the fictional movie, Black Panther, and equating Atlanta to be this black Mecca for black people, but then we have black families that are sleeping in their cars or sleeping outside of the community centers or sleeping outside of churches because the churches are not connected to the people. And so people are sleeping not in the churches, in the fellowship halls, but outside of our churches. They're sleeping outside of, our communities because we aren't connected how we used to be. So Atlanta is definitely different, like most places, but the common denominator in that difference is as much access and how technology has advanced, we are the most disconnected than I feel like our people has ever been.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you said that because when I came here, that has become one of my things that I'm still trying to understand. I think I understand it, but I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that space. I remember a long time ago, probably some 20, 25 years ago, a really good friend of mine moved to Atlanta from New York. And when he got here, he called me. He's like, yo, Kenny, I'm in Atlanta. I was like, cool. I say, how is it, man? What's going on? And at that point, I had never been to Atlanta. He was like, yo, I was just watching TV and I was watching the news. He says, because when you go into a new place, that's how you can kind of get a sense of, what's happening with us by watching the news and where we are and how they're depicting us in those spaces. And he said there was a fire here in Atlanta. And he says, but that's not what struck me as I was watching the newscast about the fire. He says, I'm watching this fire. And he said, the police on location are black. The firemen on location are black. The paramedics on location is black. The people standing outside the fire is black. The people on the news stations are black, and the people being burnt up in the fire are black. And he says it made me understand. He's like, wow, I'm like in a different place now. And when I came to Atlanta, Jason, one of the epiphanies that I had is when I was in New York. It's the thing that I admire and love about those of you. I have always seen Atlanta in particular as America's quote unquote HBCU. So if you don't go to an HBCU on a campus somewhere, if you want lived experience in living with us primarily, you come to Atlanta HBCU.
Yes.
Right? And so you get to learn about us. But the crazy thing, the thing that I struggle with, particularly in this space where we're getting ready to walk into, the space of education, and you talk about the scandals and stuff, because that was the stuff that I began to see, when I got here, and I continue to see, which is when I was in New York, we had the tendency of blaming all of our issues on the quote unquote man. Right? It's the man. He's keeping us from doing his. He's keeping us from doing that. The man won't allow us to be great, blah, blah, blah. And then when I got down here and I started seeing all that I just described, it's like, well, wait a minute. Where's the man? Because I don't see him. Like, he's not in my face. And does the man look like me? Right? And if that's the case,
That's good.
How are we struggling when we have our destiny in our own hands? right? And what about our past and history has impacted us in a way that even in control, we're still dysfunctional in getting to success in our communities. And
Yeah.
so, as we talk about this education, I want to start to lean into part of why you have now moved into this space and created or very deeply involved, co created the National Parents Union and that work. Talk to me about that work and the reason that it's so critical for our communities.
Awesome. So definitely agree with everything you just stated. Um, as a longtime educator, I always, upfront and I tell people it's assimilation or it's liberation. And
Mm,
there's really no gray line. When we think about education in the United States, it has been used to not fully educate, but educate in a sense to continue systems of oppression. And so that's why when we think about some of the issues that Black families in particular are still facing and how disproportionately Black boys and Black girls are represented in large numbers on any negative data scale that you can look at, whether it's health and diabetes or sexually transmitted diseases, if it's literacy and numeracy, if it's in the workspace, if it's ownership of homes, if it's ownership of businesses, if it's ownership of land, we are always negatively represented disproportionately in alarming numbers and rates. But we also play a major role in this. Um,
mhm,
and we have to understand how systems operate and how systems work. In particular, two systems that still have kept our people bound in ways that we unfortunately don't want to admit, and that is education and it's religion. And if we go
mm,
back to our history, we will have to understand and realize the notion and the urgency of why Sunday school is important. And just follow where I'm going with this
mhm,
conversation.
mhm,
Because by the journals of my ancestors, I knew that they were not allowed to go to grammar schools. We had to build grammar schools, but it was Sunday school. See,
mhm,
I wish an artist or like someone with the wealth and clout and ability to do this would tell the story of our spiritual journeys and the power of Sunday school. Sunday school is what was freeing a lot of people, that helped
mhm,
people get to freedom and to experience God spiritually in ways that we don't want to admit. It's almost like we're admitting this part of the story. Because
mhm,
if we're honest, Sunday school is not even something that is happening in a lot of faith-based institutions across this nation. The census
mhm,
data has showed us that 80% of this generation's parents are not connected to a faith-based institution. So when we look at violence, when we look at crime, when we look at domestic violence, when we look at divorce rates, when we look at all of the things that are negatively impacting families and children, it's because there has been a lack of spiritual foundation, but we don't even acknowledge this in literacy and numeracy when we have forgotten that Sunday school is where our ancestors learned to add, subtract,
mm,
multiply,
mhm,
read, and understand. And yes, it was from piecemealing and putting things together from what they've heard and what they've witnessed, what they've snuck and seen the pastors and priests talk about, and be able to come back and share that with their classes and their congregations. That's how we started to build HBCUs and all of the things. That was a connection. So we're
mhm,
disconnected from that now. And then with
mhm,
education, men were strategically separated because if we think back to our history, there were a lot of men who were teaching in Sunday school. There were men who were
mhm,
starting HBCUs and they were professors, and that was a very high esteemed. If we really go back, this history,
mhm,
if we really go back in history, when I go back through my ancestors' journal, they were esteemed members of their community because we valued education,
mhm,
we valued spirituality because we knew there was a connection there that was freeing our people. We
mhm,
also don't understand systems in a way to see that Black men in particular are being pushed out of these areas and not included in the family dynamics that your organization's research speaks to, and why these things are needed. And so when I came into the National Parents Union, I said, well, first of all, we are talking about education and economic justice. And as a practitioner in education, I know that this is a pink collar field, that is filled with a lot of women, but in particular, even as many cafeteria managers, principals, teachers, administrators we know that are Black women, they still are not the majority in education. White women lead our educational system, and it's in a very strategic way. And so when we think about Black boys being disproportionately represented in all of this data that speaks to human trafficking, the school to prison pipeline, suicide rates, how do we start to equate and put these things together when we don't have fathers that are not even in the conversation? This is not policy decision making. This is not funding. This is not curriculum development. In the conversation of education, period. And so our coalition is really intentional about bringing not only dads into the conversation, but also elevating the work of organizations who have been doing this intentional work around male and fatherhood for a long time, because we do not think about fathers as being an underrepresented or underserved community, but it is. Now, feminism doesn't allow that conversation because we do know that white males in particular take up a lot of room in power positions and at tables that make decisions. But we have to be realistic about fatherhood and male engagement and understand that men are not even considered in the hospitals, in the doctor's offices, in the front offices when we're asking about children's knowledge. And when they are, it's very specified to one area around discipline, where, oh, your child came in and had a smart mouth, so is the dad engaged? Can we call the dad to make sure they get them in line and get them in check? And not realizing that, again, the systems are doing their job, not so much to say for the well-being and care of our children and our families, but for us to serve as those pieces of oppression that keep us confined to what we're seeing with a lot of dysfunction and disconnection in our community.
Yeah, man, you put a lot in that, bro. Goodness, you put a lot in that. I wrote a bunch of notes that we're gonna have to come back and have some deeper conversations, about. But one of the things that you did say that struck me was this whole notion of Sunday school. And you're absolutely right, because Sunday school was the place where our community was able to take real life situations and couple them into your spirituality and that thing to which you believed in, but still allowed you to have a conversation about what was going on in the
Yes.
marketplace, right? In real life. So when you think about the importance of religion, which people, shy away from. You have to say spirituality because people don't like religion anymore. Religion has been turned into, something else. That most of what you described in terms of our movements, particularly our civil rights movement, started in the basement of churches.
Yep.
That was the safe space that we were able to come together spiritually, but talk about our real life issues in spiritual ways and practical ways, right? There was the spiritual piece of it, which is let's pray, let's get together, let's congregate, let's network. But okay, now we got to have a meeting because we got to go out and we got to go out in solidarity and we have to do X, Y, and
Yeah.
Z. But there are two other places when you were saying that, but I was like, wow, because all three of these places in my mind serve the same purpose. The first place is radio. Second place is radio, right? Where we had um, disc jockeys get on the air to play music, that
Yeah.
thing that attracted us, but was able to take real life situations and roll them into the conversations to inform community about what was happening, particularly in the church basement, right? What was the word? What did we have to pay attention to? What did we have to move in? Where do we need you to be? What do we need you to do? How do we
Yeah.
need you to respond? Those kinds of things. And then the third space, ironically, Sunday dinner, where
Yeah.
families got together every Sunday and got around the table around food and talked about real life situations with everybody at the table, right? And so there were those times where the little table had to be created for little kids so that grown folks could
Yeah.
have grown conversations, right? But grown folks still had conversations in earshot of little kids. And although we may not have understood exactly what they were talking about, we had a sense of the environment based on the tone of what was being said at Sunday dinner. And so when you think about this work now, particularly when it comes to Black men, there's nuances, right, with Black men as it relates to all of this stuff. And so, in all of these systems that have kind of like broken us up in ways that we're even struggling just simply trying to keep our families together, let alone
Sure.
trying to keep ourselves together. Like, what is the work that keeps you up at night that you're trying to accomplish when it comes to engaging, particularly Black males?
That's good. I think that helping connect the dots with brothers being engaged in economic, connecting the dots with economics, policy, and education. I think that we are sending out messages. A lot of times I'm hearing from younger Black boys, and it's like, go and be a lawyer. But what types of lawyers? Like,
Mm,
we have so many different systems. Do we have lawyers that are helping families with, maternal issues, like maternity issues, dealing with, maternity rights, but even the birth of children, like so many families that are going through issues. Are we in these spaces? Are we in the medical um, fields and areas where we have athletes that need lawyers? We have media personalities. We need entertainment lawyers. So, like, crafting our narratives in a way where we are shifting our students in, or our young people, our children, into spaces where we need growth and sustainability for us economically, politically, um, and education wise. That's why with our coalition, we're encouraging dads. Some really exciting things that we're going to be collaborating on to encourage dads to fill economic gaps. If we had more dads that were teachers, it's not $100,000, but it's 65, it's 70, and it gets you
mm,
stable health care, and it gets you in a position to say, I have this income, whether the system is tracking me or not. I have this income to be able to provide for my family. I have some other ways that I can make, money, because these brothers are working with me and connecting me and networking, right? But then
mm,
overall, I'm able to give back to my community in a way that is changing the narrative back to how Black men were seen in totality across our community, and not what
mm,
the media has painted us as, and what media music industries portray us as. Oh, okay, this is what all Black men are. This is what all Black men want. This is the story of all Black men that's giving us that opportunity to politically, economically, and educationally reshift these narratives and ultimately regain control of our freedom.
mhm. There is an African proverb that says, as long as I'm paraphrasing, but as long as the hunter is writing the story of the lion will never be told. And that is one of the things that we have to get back to as a people.
Yes.
We have to tell and orchestrate our own narrative and story. Now, I know that you combine a storytelling element into your advocacy. Talk to me a little bit about why that's important and how you do that.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So, I learned storytelling from my great grandparents, and that was something, in listening to them being, again, born in the early 1900s, being able to vote for the first, Black president, Barack
Mhm,
Obama, and to go from a time period when they were not able to go to school. My great grandparents when lamps and like refrigerators, microwaves, like these things weren't invented yet. They weren't around. And so being able to connect with them and even be a young teacher and have them speak to my students about their experiences, it's the art of storytelling that a lot of times I think we forget the value in that, how even having connections to the indigenous people of this land and how they connect to our families. We have people that come from Cuba and the islands and how they tell their stories of how historically things happened there, and they, much like here in America, saw success, right? And then the system came in and tore it down, and we had to rebuild and we had to reshape the narrative and come back again, and how these things come in cycles and that it connects across the diaspora of people of color, and how our stories connect through storytelling, and also the role that music plays, because a lot of young people are not sitting in front of them telling them stories. They're hearing stories and music is telling them, push me to the edge, all my friends are dead, right? And then we don't understand why this generation of kids are killing themselves and the numbers of suicide rates are going up. Now I came up through the '90s, and I ain't trying to, like, we had gangster rap that started, how the system started infiltrating music when gangster rap came on the scene, which was different than what rap music was, because you think about Rappers Delight and other rappers like Chris Cross were my classmates, so we were talking about Jump, but we missed the bus. Like, we were talking about real life things that we were going through and connected the dots. That storytelling element has changed. So you have songs that kids have on repeat. Push me to the edge. I need to get drugs to sustain. I need to, like, yell and be enraged against my family and my parents. It's like, this is what some of the songs are saying it in like plain words. And so now we got to think about, oh, the kids are disrespectful and they're not connected. And it's like, they look so sad. You see sadness in their eyes, but then they have these things. That's why when I do like to remind people, even though technology is changing, this is what we see young people with. Headphones, something in their ears, connected to their ears on this device. You don't know what they're listening to, but they're these songs that are telling them stories, right? We are no longer the storytellers. The system has become the storytellers. And so the system is producing a story that is something that I think reminds me that I used to hear from the church often about, coming to kill, steal, and destroy. But that's what a lot of things are doing in our mind. But we're praying about a devil with horns that we think is going to come and get our children. But that devil is already here, because it's but I also don't want to preach either. But that is the connection, right, of how we're losing so many of our young people, but we're not connecting them to the stories of people who have come out of oppression, people who have been locked up unjustly, or people who were locked up and they did things and it may have been wrong, but I was also unjustly locked up because I did something that didn't even warrant me to be in jail for a year, but I ended up being in there 8 or 9 years. And so how did I navigate and, still be able to connect to my children and my families through these stories that, again, we don't hear from these rappers because they're not getting picked up, but they're out here, they're telling their stories, but the system, of course, is not going to elevate their stories. So that's why I am invested in storytelling, because it's the everyday people story that is going to free more of our people. We got to change the system's, tactic. We can't change the system's message, but we can change the tactics of how it reaches our people.
Yeah, the other thing too is we really, I love your point in that we do have to listen to culture. Like, we have to listen to how our culture is being formed, right? It
Yes.
seems like our culture is being formed now for the benefits of making money for people who don't look like us, which
Right.
is why we keep pushing those other narratives, because they are clear about there's no money and nothing in it to push that other narrative. So we're not trying to invest in that narrative because that's about them. That's not about us. Right. And so, generationally, I think we also have to be mindful that we can't, that there are some wisdoms that have to be a part of how we
Yes.
provide solutions, uh, but the strategies got to meet the moment, right? How do we strategize to do this in a way? How can I talk to a room full of youth from a spiritual perspective to pass on a message that may be spiritually based for me, but reality based for them, right? That's the narrative, that's the storytelling, piece of it. And if you listen to the translations, I'm listening to you about, I asked my nephew the other day, my nephew's 16 years old, my son is 15. And I said, like, what's your old school? I was like, tell me what your old school is. Like when you think about old school, well, who is it? And he was like, we don't have an old school. We're like 15. Like, our real, footprint into music only started 6, 7 years ago, as they were coming. Before that, my old school is really your music, because that's what we listen to in the car, right? We listening to everything you listen to, which is why I know who Biggie is. It's why I
Yeah.
know who Marvin Gaye is. It's why I know who Kool and the Gang is. It's why I know who Earth, Wind, and Fire is. So my old school is yours. But then when I asked, depending on who I'm around, I was with a good colleague of mine in Portland not too long ago, and we were having lunch, and I asked him the question, and Jerome is probably about 28, 29, maybe 30. And I said, who's your old school? And he was like, LL. He was like naming these. I was like, bro, I was like, LL is still in concert. He can't be old school. And he was like, yeah, but old people are still in conference too. They're in old school. But it kind of hit me at that moment that intergenerational community building in all aspects of our lives is important, because you got to do it your way, right? You got to do it the way that it works for you, which means technology has to be a central part of what that looks like and how that mechanism flows. When you're working, with children in the space of kind of working with parents, like what are you seeing as the things that we really have to infiltrate for our children in a way that they need to hear it?
I'm gonna be quite honest, and I think that children aren't really hearing anything from us. They hear a lot of correction just from one of our NPU partners at Students for Equity, and this is a student group that joined NPU. It's a group of my former students and other students they've reached out to across the nation, who are like, we want to have a platform where we can actually share our own stories so people can really hear from us. Like, everybody's talking about literacy, gang violence, other issues with bullying and things that they perceive young people to go through, but no one is actually talking to them. And so I think that the biggest message barrier is that there's no actual communication. And so I think identifying the issue, but also reminding people of solutions, the work through Fathers Incorporated and what you all have done through connecting with people where they are, that works. And so that's why we are being intentional about connecting our partners with what is already working. And in community, it goes back to the marketplace. And just to remind us of religious teaching, if you're Muslim, you're Jewish, if you are Christian, if you are spiritualist, if you are Buddhist, whatever like religion you subscribe to, we remember that these religions were created by teachers. I want y'all to follow the story. Created by teachers, right? Who were teaching people, and they were using the train the trainer model because most of them had prophets and people who worked alongside of them. And what did these prophets do? They moved to different places and were reaching other people who lived in different places, who had different cultures. They lived in different ways. And so there was a common thread of messaging around love and community. And this is what people were building. And now how are we recreating these things to connect that messaging and connect the dots? And that is meeting people where they are. So when I think about barbershops, for example, like, we know who does that well. We know who created
Right.
that way of creating community. And so I'm encouraging people to let's reach these young people where they are and start having real like conversations, and yet put on their music and ask them like, hey, this is kind of ritualistic, like the things that they're just repeating, does that make sense to you? Like, what do you think? And that will allow them to be like, hey, you know what, I really don't even like this, but it's just what's going on right now. Or they may say things that my peers and I were saying in the 90s, like, I like the beat. Like,
Right.
the beats really do get you. Like, you really,
Right.
even though, like, the song is trash, like the lyrics are trash, but it is the beat. But we don't know that if we're not having conversation. And so to answer the question, the issue is we're not having conversation, but also for people who sometimes get stuck in what the issue is, there are clear solutions right here that you're connected to. Like, get connected to some of these models that are already in place and see, like, how can I fit in? Even if you don't, I got locks. I may not go to the barbershop, but I show up in barbershops all the time just to be like, hey, I'm in the conversation and I'm promoting my
Gotta
book,
connect.
right? And I'm doing A, B, and C,
Yeah.
because it's community there and we still have to be connected. We can't have conversation if we don't have community.
Yeah. Couple of things. One is when I was reading that about you, it's crazy because I am like in the middle of reading like 2 books around storytelling, and
Dope.
and presentation essentials, and really trying to figure out how to take my messaging and put it in story form. What is the new scroll, right? Because as we talk about griots and as we talk about storytellers, it's one thing to tell a story, but the story also has to be documented. We know that all the way back to hieroglyphics, right?
Yeah.
Someone had to tell the story and write the story and make it plain for others to be able to carry it forward without the context of the narrative changing for the sake of someone's benefit, which is really what happened to the word, right? Which is really how the
Yeah.
word got bastardized. It got changed in context to mean something else for someone else's benefit. But what's the new scroll for us? Because it was music. It could be books. Is the new scroll for us social media?
Okay, so let me say social media, but I also will say it's what we're doing right now. It's podcasting. And so the work that I'm doing with storytelling through educational entities is helping people be intentional about how we're sharing our stories. Are we connected to platforms? If you're writing a book, do you have an audio version? Um, what if I don't like my voice, but I need someone that can read my story with the same vision and spirit that I have in mind? We support that because, again, there's an art to storytelling. And I'm excited about this because having students who have become, film producers, who are rappers, who are in the arts, like being able to connect that, even engineers that connect to music. Like, we are all throughout the space of storytelling, and I don't think that people connect those dots. And so podcasting is a way for us to not just share stories, but continue conversations. And podcasts, again, they connect to books. They connect to workbooks that we have. They connect to traditional forms of storytelling that our ancestors used that are also like resurfacing in new, um, but yet innovative ways. So storytelling is a powerful piece to going back to storytelling was a major key to how we found freedom and being able to live free spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and also economically. That's what we're trying to
Yeah,
get more people to.
absolutely. So tell me about Suit Swag and Success.
Suit Swag and Success is my very, very first book, y'all. I'm super excited about it. Holding it in my hand is interesting. Uh, Very intentional though. Suit Swag and Success is my very first book. It's connected to my podcast, Speak Black Man, in an effort to share stories around Black boys, Black men that we do not hear about. In particular, success stories from fathers, right? Hearing stories from Black male educators and what we're actually seeing in our schools and our communities. but also sharing strategies. I've been in the game 19 years in education, and I have seen data that speaks to the detriment of our students, but I've also seen my students who, have records, that have broken into schools, that have,
Mhm.
done all kind of things, but they are very much in this day right now at 155. They are leading schools, they are teachers, they are working in their cities and their county, they are business owners, they are parents, leading their kids. They are, some of them are preachers that are doing some grassroots work through their schools. But it's the strategies that I've included in this book, Suit, Swag, and Success, that speaks to the power of our presence. It talks about the power in our being. Like, everybody loves our swag, but they can't
Mhm.
stand us. So understanding the power in your swag and how to protect that, but also the success in our gifts. We don't talk about truly what it means to be gifted and talented. Our education system has made us believe that, oh, you're only gifted and talented if you can read the King's language and you can,
Mm.
master a math test. But we have a lot of mechanics who are gifted and talented, and they don't have any formal training, but they can take your Porsche apart and rebuild it to where it works better than it was when it was constructed. And they don't
Mm.
have any formal education, and they may have a GED. But see, they were
Wow.
gifted and talented, and no one shared with them strategies of how to
Mhm.
use their gifts. So that's what my first book is centered around, helping us reach this generation of young people in ways that, unfortunately, a lot of our schools have not been successful in doing.
Hmm. There's a lot of efforts around the country now to encourage Black men to go into the space of education and be teachers. And I know that that is a struggle. Um, for one, you mentioned earlier, which is salary, right? And where guys want to make a livable wage if they're going to do X job, the honor that used to be around teaching and some of those other things aren't what they used to be, and so people are looking for other things. How do you and what do you say to a young man who's going into college, who doesn't really know what they want to do, but you want to kind of inform them or encourage them to think about education and teaching?
That's good. I will say this: a connecting point for education is social justice. Like, a lot of people get frustrated around, man, the health insurance is going up. You know, it's not safe in my community. When I drive on this side of town, they have this, we don't have this. So it's sometimes about getting involved in our local politics and really
Hmm.
seeing how locally I do have power as a taxpaying citizen, getting involved in um, the things that are right in my community. And I think that once people see that, I didn't know, being an abolitionist teacher, that I would be in a space where I am now, leading partnerships for a nonprofit and having meetings with the United States Department of Education and with the vice president and staff, and like organizing and advocating in a policy space of education. Like, I didn't know that. I knew what my ancestors had done and how, as a teacher, I'm supposed to move the ship forward and advocating. And but I didn't know that there were spaces where there are actually careers and people who do this. I just happened to, like, open my mouth and fall into a space, and someone was like, "Hey, you're good for this, and we need more people like you in that space." And so I think that getting connected, that's the issue, right? That I just gave, but now here's the solution: getting connected to the organizations like Fathers Inc., like the Center for
Hmm.
Black Educator Development, like Profound Gentlemen, Profound Ladies. If you were in Atlanta, helping empower young people. So finding, like, organizations that are doing, Lillie's Foundation, that are doing grassroots organization locally, and then getting connected. And that's how we, help people find their niche. And that's what I would
Hmm.
encourage people to do, especially with, I had a student, former student, who was like, "I want to be a preacher," but no one, there's no, let's be honest about this. If a student came up to you and said, "I want to be a preacher," what career path do you put them on? Because
Right.
there's not one that says, "Hey, if you want to be a preacher, here's what we have for people who are interested in being a faith-based leader, but we also don't have social justice like pathways either. So now we have to gear them to a very broad area of like, okay, we'll go into education or go into law, but they a lot of times don't find their niche. But if they can connect to people in the community that are doing grassroots work, then they know like, oh, I could become like economic analyst. Well, what is that? That's somebody that connects research and programs around underserved communities and how we get more funding to them. But are we telling black kids that they can do this? Because that's a person right there that's connecting dollars to programs that are helping the very people in the community we're saying that need help. But if our kids don't know that these positions are out here, then we can't put them in position to really help us change the economic and educational landscape for us to, again, gain more freedom.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you said that, I was like, what would I tell somebody if they came and said that to me? And I was like, I actually know exactly what I would say. Go live a little, because you need some life. If you're going into preaching business, you need some life. You need something to be able to lean back on to make a connection with people you're talking to, because the vast majority of them are coming to you with life issues.
Yeah.
So go and do
Problem
some
solving.
of the go and get some skills and some of the talents you're going to need to be a preacher. Psychology, sociology, communication, business, all of those things you're going to need to be a preacher, but you're not going to
Anthropology.
Anthropology, right?
Learning, you got to learn the environment, but you also have to learn how these things have changed over time. But see, our people are not in anthropology. I met a sister that was doing some anthropology work in Arizona, and I was like, this is super dope. And I asked her, I said, how many of us are in this space? And she said, I may be like one of, in a room of 50 people, I might be one. There might be someone else that comes. And so now how do we even get us connected to those spaces? We had to study to show ourselves approved.
Yeah, I wish you got to introduce me to her. I would love to talk to her. Have you spoken to Dr. Alvin Thomas yet?
No.
Oh, I got to get you on his podcast. He does the Black Fatherhood podcast.
Okay, that would be awesome.
He's in. I'm actually going to speak at his conference in Wisconsin in October. I think it's in October. Okay. But he actually does his black male work through ecology. And so when I found that out, I was like, whoa. I was like, yo, tell me. I'm curious about that. I was like, why'd you end up doing this work through ecology? And he was like, how are you going to work with people if you don't understand their environments?
Yeah,
like,
that's good.
You gotta study environments.
The systems,
yeah.
I mean, even with, for example, when we tell kids go and be a lawyer, I will never forget going to a PWI. I was like, yeah, my interest is law, and I've already done like pre-law, and it was like, absolutely not. You need to major in English, which is why my major is English, because I was going to become a lawyer, because that is what prepares you for the research and how to understand language that is used in different ways to create policy, and the system design of it comes through English. But see, we don't teach and prepare black children for that. What black children hear is, oh, you want to become a lawyer, go right into pre-law, and you're doing the pre-law work, which is great. But it's hard to sustain that because you haven't had the foundational lift of, hey, have you read 3 books in a week and like analyzed them and done the research and done the foot clips, done the notes? Because English prepares you for that, because that's what the actual lift of going into law school is. And we lose black kids the first year of it because they aren't prepared. But it goes to your analogy of how they ended up in ecology and understanding where people are living in their environments. How are we preparing our kids to go into these spaces and making sure they're connected to the right foundational elements? And that was a great example.
Yeah.
Great example.
Listen, tell people how they can get in touch with you and how they can get involved with the National Parent Union.
Awesome. The National Parents Union is a network of grassroots organizations. It is free to join us as a partner, as an affiliate, an individual member. Go to nationalparentsunion.org and get connected. My email address is jason@npunion.org. union.org. So that's N as in Nancy, P as in Pear, union.org. My first name will definitely connect you to myself and the work of the National Parents Union.
Okay, yeah, I got to get my paperwork into you. I know you sent me an email some time ago, and I just was in a space wasn't able to do it. You might have to send it to me again.
Okay,
so I don't
we'll
have to
do.
search
We'll
for it,
do.
so I can get that stuff to you. But thank you, brother. I appreciate you, man. I'm in 1,000% support of everything that you're trying to do and whatever it is we could do for you. I'm only a phone call away. And to my I Am Dad podcast listeners, thank you so much for listening to another episode of I Am Dad podcast. Our host today, Jason Allen. He's with the National Parents Union. You know how I like to leave you. Always be kind to others as you're kind to yourself, or you might find yourself by yourself. Always shoot high for your goals, because even if you miss, you'll be amongst the stars. And that's my good friend Art Mitchell always said to me, it's nice to be important, but you know what? It's much more important to be nice. Until next Sunday, peace out.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting IamDadPodcast.com. That's IamDadPodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am dad, period.